As the last rays of the sun took away the day's fatigue, I found myself lost in thought within the quiet of the home. As a young woman living with her mother, my life might seem quite ordinary from the outside. However, every family has its unique secrets and stories, and ours was no different. My mother, Jane, had separated from my father when I was just 5, and since then, we had tried to make a life together. She took on the role of both mother and best friend, facing life's challenges together. Jane was a strong and independent woman. Even in my father's absence, she carried life on her shoulders, always striving to be enough for me. Her determination alone was enough reason for my admiration. Yet, like anyone, she was lonely, and over time, this loneliness led her to desire companionship. Thus, 6 years ago, the entrance of Dan into our lives changed everything. Initially, accepting Dan was difficult for me. My mother's attention was no longer solely focused on me. A new man had started to occupy an important place in our lives. The privacy of our home changed, and the intimacy previously shared between my mother and me gave way to a secretive existence. However, Dan's presence eventually became an escape for me as well. Seeing him and my mother together made me reassess everything in my life. At first, I struggled to accept the situation and understand my feelings. Over time, however, I realized that this secret world was also drawing me in. Dan, younger than my mother with a well-maintained physique for his age, was undeniably attractive to me at 18. This was an opportunity to turn a new page in my life, bringing relationships and emotions I'd seen online into my own experience. This experience introduced me to feelings I had never known before. It was a beginning for me to explore my own body and unleash my imagination. And with Dan's presence, this journey of discovery became even more complicated. Our relationship took on unexpected and boundary-pushing dimensions over time. Thus, the backstory narrates how the seemingly ordinary life of a young girl living with her mother was turned upside down with the arrival of a new man, impacting the process of discovering herself and her desires. This process marked the beginning of a journey filled with complex emotions and unforgettable memories for me, Anita. My interest in Dan evolved over time to be more than just a physical attraction. His presence encouraged me to explore and live out my desires. However, this situation made the relationship with my mother more complicated. Although she seemed happy with this new man in her life, I was unsure how to express my own feelings. Therefore, I decided to live out my own experiences, starting relationships with different men to explore what Dan indirectly taught me. These relationships with men, each with their own stories and pasts, introduced me to different aspects of life, yet none could fully satisfy the emotions that the scene I witnessed in that room had evoked in me. Therefore, I continued to live out my relationships with the door ajar, trying to capture Dan's attention and make him understand what he had taught me. This complicated the dynamics in our home even further, and Dan's reactions prompted me to question my feelings more deeply. My efforts to capture Dan's attention led to an unexpected outcome. One night, while secretly listening to him in the kitchen, I realized that his relationship with my mother was much more complex than I had imagined. The intimacy and laughter in their phone conversation revealed who Dan truly was and the secrets he harbored. This shook me to my core and made me question my mother's trust in this man. My feelings for Dan, alongside these new discoveries, became even more complicated. These events marked the beginning of a new era in my mother's life and mine. The feelings I harbored towards Dan and the truths I learned about him led me to make decisions that would forever change our lives. In this story filled with complex emotions, hidden mysteries, and unexpected turns, I realized that my mother and I needed to reshape our lives. While trying to understand who Dan truly was and the real dynamics of his relationship with my mother, I embarked on a journey to discover my own identity and desires. During this process, I decided to prioritize my mother's happiness above everything else. Together, we formed a strong front to overcome the turmoil Dan had created in our lives. The emotional turmoil I experienced with Dan, especially after those secret moments, intensified. These feelings left me torn between guilt and curiosity, caught between my loyalty to my mother and my attraction to Dan. Over time, however, I realized that my mother's happiness was more important than anything else. Therefore, I decided to cut all ties with Dan and minimize his impact on our lives. The emotional turmoil I experienced with Dan, especially after those secret moments, intensified. These feelings left me torn between guilt and curiosity, caught between my loyalty to my mother and my attraction to Dan. Over time, however, I realized that my mother's happiness was more important than anything else. Therefore, I decided to cut all ties with Dan and minimize his impact on our lives. This process strengthened my relationship with my mother. The time we spent together helped us distance ourselves from all the negativity Dan's presence had caused. Our bond gave us resilience and courage through this difficult period. Our trust and love for each other allowed us to emerge from Dan's shadow and rebuild our own happiness. In conclusion, these experiences matured me as an individual and deepened my relationship with my mother. The entrance of Dan into our lives and the subsequent events taught me that we could overcome any difficulties we might face in life and that we could always turn to each other in any situation. Together with my mother, we are more hopeful and determined that we can overcome any obstacle life throws at us and create our happiness on our own terms.